We are no longer colonies. We are sovereign nations, and if they come for one of us, they come for all of us. Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak those words from behind a velvet curtain or in the safety of closed chambers. He stood in the heart of Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso, looking straight into the cameras as if staring down Benjamin Netanyahu himself. The rumor had been circling for days that the Israeli Prime Minister had sent a warning to African leaders: fall in line or face the consequences. Whether Netanyahu said it or not no longer mattered. The tone was the same one Africa has been hearing for centuries, dressed in new clothes, but carrying the same weight of old empires. This was not a polite diplomatic reply. It was a refusal, clear, unapologetic, and dangerous. A moment that would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso and deep into the future of Africa news. If you have ever believed that dignity should not be negotiated, if you've ever wondered what leadership sounds like when it refuses to kneel, stay with me until the end. Because the story you're about to hear is not just about one man or one nation. It's about a continent daring to stand. Rumors are like sparks in the dry season. They do not wait for permission to spread. The one that lit Ouagadougou in early February carried a familiar scent, a foreign warning whispered across headlines and back channels, allegedly from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the leaders of Africa. It was said to be blunt: fall in line or pay the price. For those outside the continent, it may sound like political theater. For those within it, echoed the old language of control, the same tone that once came through the orders of colonial governors, the memos of foreign ministries, the contracts of the International Monetary Fund. In Burkina Faso, that echo touched something raw. The country has lived through coup sanctions and the long shadow of outside armies. But it has also carried a legacy of defiance from Thomas Sankara's revolution in the 1980s to today's leadership under Ibrahim Traoré. That history is not written in marble halls. It is carved into the lives of farmers who remember when their gold, cotton, and land were priced in foreign capitals, not in Ouagadougou's markets. Beyond Burkina Faso, the Sahel is shifting. Mali and Niger have turned away from Western military partnerships, expelling troops who once patrolled their soil. Guinea's leaders speak openly of resource sovereignty. Across West Africa, the idea of integration is no longer an academic dream. It is a survival strategy. Globally, this alignment is drawing eyes and unease. Africa news cycles have begun to tell a story many in Washington, Paris, and Tel Aviv would rather avoid: that a young generation of leaders is willing to burn the script handed to them. In 1955, African and Asian leaders met in Bandung, Indonesia, declaring they would not be pawns in the Cold War. In 2025, the echoes of Bandung are returning, but this time the stage is not shared with foreign patrons. This time, the demand is not for recognition. It is for respect. That is the soil in which Traoré's words took root, not as a reaction to a single rumor, but as the flowering of decades of quiet resistance now finding its voice, a voice that says to the world, Africa will not bow. The day of the press conference began without ceremony. No military parade, no prelude of anthems, just the hot sun over Ouagadougou, the hum of air conditioners in a crowded hall, and the metallic click of cameras being tested by journalists who knew something was about to happen. By noon, more than 120 journalists from at least 15 countries had filled the seats. Television crews from Mali and Niger squeezed beside reporters from Ghana, South Africa, and Al Jazeera. Even a few Western correspondents lingered at the edges, not sure if this was going to be newsworthy or simply another African leader's statement, destined to fade into the noise. Then Ibrahim Traoré walked in. No script in hand, no teleprompter, just a steady gaze and the quiet confidence of a man who had made up his mind long before this moment. For a few seconds, the room stilled, not because of his youth or his military fatigues, but because he looked directly into the cameras as though the person he meant to address was standing behind each lens. You say Africa must obey. He began, his voice low but hard. You threaten us with consequences. We have heard this voice before. It spoke French in the 1800s. It spoke English in the 1900s. Today it speaks Hebrew. But it is the same voice. And today we answer. There was no mistaking who the you was. The rumor, whether true or not, had already done its work. It had given shape to something many Africans felt, but rarely heard in official speeches. The recognition that foreign powers still believed it could dictate terms to sovereign nations. We are not colonies, Traoré said, letting each word breathe. We are sovereign nations. Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv. We do not answer to Washington. We do not answer to any force that thinks it can buy us or bomb us into submission. It was not the language of polite diplomacy. It was the language of refusal, and in a continent used to leaders choosing the safe road, that refusal landed like a strike of lightning. The Africa news feeds lit up within minutes. Clips of the speech began circulating on X, TikTok, and Telegram. By the time Traoré stepped away from the podium, the hashtag #Africa will not bow was already trending, racking up 1.2 million uses in 24 hours. In Bamako, Mali's Colonel Assimi Goïta reposted the clip to his 2.4 million followers, calling Traoré's stance the voice of a free Africa. In Conakry, Guinea's President Mamadi Doumbouya went on live television to declare, "This is the courage our people have been waiting for." Across rural Niger, farmers gathered around battery-powered radios to hear the speech rebroadcast by community stations. In Johannesburg, students set up loudspeakers in a campus courtyard, playing the video between protest chants. The room where the speech was given had gone silent when it ended, but outside, the reaction was explosive. The silence in the hall wasn't hesitation. It was history pressing down on everyone present. They knew that in one afternoon, Traoré had crossed an invisible line, one that most leaders avoided for fear of what might follow. And yet, he had not done it recklessly. This was not the outburst of a young man eager for headlines. This was calculated not to provoke chaos, but to make it impossible to ignore the truth. For decades, more than $100 billion in minerals and raw materials had been extracted from Africa each year, while much of the population lived on less than $2 a day. That wasn't an accident. It was a system. And Traoré had just named it out loud. Internationally, reactions split along predictable lines. Paris and London called the remarks unhelpful and inflammatory. Pan-African commentators called them necessary and overdue. Tel Aviv issued no statement at all. In Washington, a few anonymous officials muttered about unconstructive rhetoric, but no one dared engage him directly. In Burkina Faso, the mood was electric. In the markets of Ouagadougou, vendors played the speech on portable speakers. Taxi drivers replayed it for passengers. In the rural north, elders told children, "This is the same fight we fought when the French left. But now we have a leader in the palace." For many, it wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration that the era of quiet compliance was over. And in the eyes of his supporters, if that meant confrontation with the world's most powerful nations, so be it. The power of that afternoon lay not only in the words themselves, but in the way they broke an unspoken rule that Africa must always measure its tone, must always consider how the powerful will respond. In that press hall, Ibrahim Traoré measured nothing. He spoke as if the only approval he needed was from the people who had entrusted him with their future. And in that moment, the people from Ouagadougou to Lagos, from Cape Town to Cairo, decided he was speaking for them too. Truth, when spoken plainly, has a strange effect. It doesn't just fill a room. It travels uninvited into places it was never meant to reach. Within hours of Ibrahim Traoré's declaration in Ouagadougou, it was doing exactly that. The video of his speech spread like fire in dry grass. The Africa news cycle, usually dominated by stories written from Paris or London, suddenly bent toward Burkina Faso. In Bamako, it was replayed at street rallies. In Conakry, it ran on a loop in public squares. In Johannesburg, students projected it on the side of a lecture hall, the words, "We are no longer colonies," stretching across concrete like a banner. And then came the silence, not from the streets, but from the capitals that had been named. Tel Aviv offered no denial, no rebuttal. Washington's response was little more than a shrug, couched in diplomatic phrases about constructive engagement. In Paris, commentators filled airtime with speculation about Traoré's radical leanings, but the French Foreign Ministry chose not to speak. For many Africans, that silence was more telling than any rebuttal. If the words were false, why not dispute them? If they were reckless, why not condemn them? The absence of a counterattack was in the minds of millions proof that the truth had hit its target. But the real exposure was not in the reaction of foreign governments. It was in the way the speech stripped bare an old unspoken agreement between Africa's ruling elite and its former colonizers. You keep the resources flowing, we'll keep the public quiet. Traoré had broken that pact in daylight before cameras with no attempt to soften the blow. For decades, leaders who challenged the system had been sidelined, overthrown, or assassinated. From Patrice Lumumba in the Congo to Thomas Sankara here in Burkina Faso, the pattern was brutal and consistent. And yet, Traoré had spoken in the open, daring history to repeat itself. The ripple was immediate. Across the Sahel, radio call-in shows, filled with voices demanding a review of foreign mining contracts. In Niger, student unions called for their government to join Burkina Faso in rejecting aid with chains. In Ghana, taxi drivers debated whether their own leaders would have the courage to say what Traoré had said. On social media, the hashtag #ShimoAfrica will not bow became more than a slogan. It became a rallying point. Diaspora communities in London, New York, and Toronto organized online forums to discuss resource sovereignty and African unity. One clip of Traoré saying, "If you come for one of us, you come for all of us," reached 15 million views in just 5 days. The truth being exposed was not new. Africans had long known that more than $100 billion worth of minerals and raw materials leave the continent each year, while much of its population survives on less than $2 a day. They knew about the lopsided contracts signed under pressure the military bases built in the name of security, but serving other agendas. What was new was hearing a sitting president lay it out without apology. International analysts noticed. In Washington, think tanks' policy papers warned that Ibrahim Traoré's tone could encourage other African leaders to distance themselves from Western influence, possibly aligning more with China, Russia, or each other. In European capitals, diplomats debated whether ignoring the speech would make it fade or feed its legend. Meanwhile, the grassroots reaction deepened. In Dakar, Senegal, graffiti artists painted Traoré's face beside the words, "Power is not size, power is courage." In Nairobi, activists projected the Ouagadougou speech onto a downtown skyscraper. In Accra, schoolchildren recited excerpts at a Pan-African Day assembly. The Africa news networks that played the speech in full saw record viewership spikes. Independent broadcasters added subtitles in English, French, Arabic, and Swahili, ensuring no corner of the continent would miss the message. Still, there was danger in the air. History has shown that when truth threatens entrenched systems, it is often met not with open debate, but with quiet retaliation. The silence from foreign capitals could be the calm before a storm: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, or the resurrection of old smear campaigns. But in that moment, the focus was not on what might come. It was on what had just been said, and the fact that it had been said at all. For once, Africa was not waiting for outside validation. The applause was coming from within, from the markets, the fields, the schools, the streets. And so the truth stood in the open. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, had looked at the old order and refused to kneel. Whether the world liked it or not, the line had been drawn. It was more than a speech. It was a mirror, and in that reflection, millions saw a continent they had been told could not exist united, unafraid, and unwilling to bow. The morning after Ibrahim Traoré's speech, Ouagadougou awoke to the sound of horns and the sight of flags fluttering from balconies. It was February 3, 2025, and to many in Burkina Faso, it felt like the first day of a new era. By noon, an estimated 15,000 people had gathered in Revolution Square without any official call to assemble. They came with drums, banners, and a sense of pride that needed no script. Some carried radios replaying his words. Others wore shirts printed overnight with the phrase, "Africa will not bow." Inside the presidential offices, the effects were immediate. Ministers reported thousands of letters, emails, and handwritten notes from citizens across the country. Most carried a single line: "We stand with you." Local administrators said the same was happening in rural provinces. Farmers riding bicycles to town just to send a message of support through the post. The momentum did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, local assemblies passed symbolic resolutions endorsing Traoré's stance and calling for deeper cooperation within the Sahel Alliance. Niger followed suit. Within 2 weeks, joint military drills were scheduled for March 2025, involving over 4,000 troops from the 3 member states. But the consequences were not just military. Economic sovereignty leapt from political speeches into the public square. In Ouagadougou's marketplaces, vendors launched sovereignty markets where only locally produced goods were sold. Students at the University of Ouagadougou started a Made in Burkina campaign, pledging to wear only domestically manufactured clothing for the rest of the academic year. The government moved quickly. The Ministry of Energy announced a plan to renegotiate 5 major mining contracts by mid-2025, aiming to keep a greater share of gold and uranium profits inside Burkina Faso. For decades, those resources had enriched foreign corporations, while leaving villages without electricity or clean water. Now the demand was clear: the nation's wealth must serve its people first. Not everyone welcomed this defiance. Western diplomats quietly warned of potential sanctions if foreign troops were expelled before existing agreements expired. Economic analysts projected that Burkina Faso could face a $250 million budget shortfall in 2026 if certain aid packages were withdrawn. The administration responded by accelerating talks with alternative partners, regional African banks, private investors from Asia, and neighboring states willing to trade without political strings. It was a gamble, but one that many saw as worth the risk. In the streets, the mood remained defiant. As one young activist told a local reporter, "We would rather walk through hardship with our heads high than live comfortably on our knees." That sentiment echoed across the Sahel. In Mali and Niger, the speech was being taught in political science classes. In Guinea, murals of Traoré appeared on walls in Conakry, alongside quotes about sovereignty. Across Africa, news outlets, the narrative was no longer whether his words were reckless, but whether other leaders would have the courage to follow them. Even in regions far from the political centers, the wave of unity was tangible. In rural villages, elders compared the moment to the anti-colonial struggles of the 1960s, telling children, "This is the same fight, but now we have a leader in the palace." Of course, every action has a shadow. International financial institutions began reviewing credit terms for Burkina Faso. Foreign media outlets, which had largely ignored the speech, started running analyses questioning the country's stability and leadership. Some domestic opponents accused the government of risking isolation for the sake of headlines. Yet the core of the public seemed unmoved by these warnings. The common refrain was simple: risk is the price of dignity. The days after the speech revealed a truth that no sanction or editorial could erase. A large portion of the African public was hungry for leaders who would speak without fear and act without asking permission. And whether one agreed with his politics or not, Ibrahim Traoré had shown that such leadership was still possible. It was clear now, the February 3rd speech was not the end of a news cycle. It was the opening act of something larger. What began in a crowded press hall in Ouagadougou was already rewriting alliances, redirecting economies, and reawakening a continent's memory of its own power. To the untrained eye, Ibrahim Traoré's speech on February 3rd looked like a bold one-day headline, the kind of fiery rhetoric that stirs crowds but eventually fades under the weight of realpolitik. But anyone studying African geopolitics could see something deeper, a pivot point. Traoré's words were not simply about rejecting an alleged warning from Benjamin Netanyahu. They were a deliberate move to reframe the terms of Africa's engagement with the world. In the space of a few minutes, the president of Burkina Faso had transformed a rumor into a rallying cry, and that rallying cry into the foundation of a strategic shift. The first layer was psychological. For decades, African nations have been told directly or through the subtler channels of diplomacy that their power lies in compliance. Aid, trade, and security were conditioned on following the lead of Washington, Paris, Brussels, or now Tel Aviv. By refusing even the tone of such a message, Traoré disrupted that conditioning. His stance was not only heard in capitals, it was felt in the minds of African citizens who began to imagine politics without the leash. The second layer was structural. Within 2 weeks, the speech had accelerated plans for a West African sovereignty pact, a proposed expansion of the Sahel alliance that included Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and observers from Guinea and Chad. The most controversial clause under discussion, no foreign military base in one member state without unanimous approval from all. Strategically, this changes the game. It means that no external power can play divide and station politics using one government's consent as a wedge to maintain regional dominance. For outside observers, especially in the US and Israel, this is not just rhetoric. It is a potential shift in military and resource control. The Sahel sits atop vast reserves of gold, uranium, and untapped solar energy potential. A coordinated bloc could negotiate contracts, collectively resist lopsided trade terms, and redirect profits toward domestic infrastructure. The third layer was economic. Traoré's follow-up policies, renegotiating mining contracts, launching local production campaigns, and exploring non-Western financing signal that the speech was not an isolated act of defiance, but part of a broader strategy to diversify Burkina Faso's economic dependencies. Critics call this risky. Supporters call it overdue. History may call it both. The fourth layer was symbolic, and symbolism matters. Across Africa, news platforms' images of Traoré clasping hands with Mali's Assimi Goïta and Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya in Bamako became instant icons. In the Cold War, similar photos at the Bandung Conference or the founding of the Non-Aligned Movement symbolized that smaller nations could coordinate without superpower oversight. The Bamako imagery serves a similar function for a new generation proof that African leaders can stand together publicly without waiting for a green light from Paris or Washington. For an older American audience, this is not an alien script. The logic mirrors moments in U.S. history when ordinary citizens demanded their leaders step away from entrenched systems. The Civil Rights Movement refusing Jim Crow's rules, the anti-war protests rejecting Washington's narrative on Vietnam, the post-Watergate demand for transparency in power. The actors change, but the moral confrontation is the same, a refusal to accept that those at the top get to define what is possible or permissible. The fifth layer is the risk calculus. No strategic pivot comes without countermoves. Sanctions, credit downgrades, targeted media campaigns, and even covert destabilization are not far-fetched. Traoré's critics argue that without diversified revenue streams and strong domestic institutions, Burkina Faso could be vulnerable to economic shocks. They point to the nation's limited industrial base, volatile agricultural yields, and reliance on imported goods as pressure points foreign powers could exploit. But here lies the wager that sovereignty once claimed can inspire domestic mobilization. Strong enough to withstand external pressure, by tying national pride to tangible policy changes from mining revenue retention to rural electrification. Traoré is betting that the population will endure short-term hardship for long-term control. The sixth layer is the contagion effect. Already whispers in other African capitals suggest that leaders are studying Burkina Faso's playbook. Could East African nations coordinate on water rights for the Nile without Western mediation? Could Central African states form a mineral pricing consortium akin to OPEC? The precedent being set is less about content and more about posture. Africa, speaking for itself in negotiations where it has long been spoken about. Finally, the seventh layer is the narrative battlefield. In an age where perception drives policy, controlling the Africa news cycle is as strategic as controlling a gold mine. Traoré's speech reframed the narrative from a small Sahel nation. Confronts powerful countries to a young Africa, confronts an outdated order. This framing resonates with youth across the continent and with diaspora communities who see their own struggles reflected in the push for dignity and self-determination. The risk remains high. A misstep could isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically or plunge its economy into crisis. But as one elder in Bamako put it, a man walking on his feet can stumble. A man on his knees can only crawl. Traoré has chosen to walk, and by walking, he has invited the rest of Africa to rise alongside him. What began as a response to an unverified warning may, in retrospect, be remembered as the moment Africa stopped asking for permission and started setting its own terms. If you have marched for justice before in Selma in Washington or on the streets of your own hometown, you know this truth. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. On February 3, 2025, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world and claimed it on behalf of Burkina Faso and a continent. He did not wait for permission. He did not seek applause from distant capitals. He spoke to the people who live with the weight of decisions made thousands of miles away and told them the weight could be lifted. For many outside Africa, the story barely registered in the mainstream cycle. But for millions here, and for the diaspora watching, it was a turning point. Across Africa, news channels, the speech is replayed not as an artifact of defiance, but as a blueprint for what leadership can look like when it refuses to kneel. This is where you, wherever you stand, become part of the question. Will you measure a leader by the comfort of his allies or by the courage of his convictions? Will you judge a nation by the size of its GDP or by its willingness to stand on its own feet? We know the risks of this path. Sanctions may come. Isolation may be attempted. But the alternative is to keep crawling while others walk over us. So
2018
we
saw
choose
the
to
abolition
walk,
of the death
and we invite
penalty
you
in
to
Burkina
walk with
Faso.
us across borders,
But the military
across
regime is
oceans,
suddenly
across the
changing its
lines
mind,
drawn to keep us divided.
claiming that serious
Because
crimes
if you
call
have
for
ever
serious
believed in
punishment.
justice, now is the time to remember why.